All right? Now that's the broad picture. Let's drill down to some of the details. Let's take a quick tour of some of the front lines of the global war against Christians. The first we'll talk about is Iraq. As you can see on the slide, ladies and gentlemen, it is a fact, and again, not a theory or a hunch or sort of paranoid fantasy, it is a fact that a Christian community in Iraq that as recently as 1991, the year of the first US-led Gulf War in Iraq, as of that year, this was the second largest Christian community anywhere in the Middle East, an estimate of almost 2 million Christians in Iraq, most of them Chaldean Orthodox, but also with a strong Chaldean Catholic population. And this was a church that can trace its origins all the way back to the time of the apostles, okay, more than 2,000 years of history. And that church has essentially been gutted in the arc of simply 2 decades. Today, the high-end estimate from the number of Christians left in Iraq is around 400,000. Some people think it is closer to 200 or 250,000. Many of them have gone into exile. There are now more Iraqi Christians living in refugee camps in Jordan than are left in Iraq, and there are more Chaldean Christians from Baghdad living in the suburbs of Detroit than there are left in Baghdad. But they're not all exiles. An astonishing number of them have actually been killed. And the symbolic sort of moment listed here on the slide would be the siege of Our Lady of Salvation on October 31st, 2010. Now, in itself, the fact that this storied Catholic Chaldean cathedral was bombed on that day is no novelty. The sobering truth is that of the 63 Christian churches in Iraq, 40 of them have been bombed at least once since 2003, the beginning of the second US-led invasion in Iraq. However, what followed that day was new, because after the bombs went off, a group of armed Islamic radical gunmen stormed the church. They shot the priest who was saying Mass, they shot the 2 deacons who were assisting him, and they killed 33 other people, for a total of 36 victims that day. Now, I actually had the opportunity shortly after that siege to interview one of the survivors, a young Chaldean Catholic woman by the name of Fatima, who is now in Rome. She was singing in the choir on that day, and as she saw her choir mates fall under a hail of bullets, she went onto the ground, pulled a couple of their bodies over her, and played dead for the 6 hours that it took the Iraqi Defense Forces to arrive and liberate the church. Now, she has since moved to Rome, and she now spends her every waking moment trying to help her fellow Chaldean Christians get out of Iraq because she is profoundly convinced that they have no future there. Now, one hopes she is wrong, but it is impossible to fault the chain of reasoning that has led her to that conclusion. Okay? And the final point on the slide, if we can just see the slide one more time. The final point on the slide, ladies and gentlemen, is this. And believe me, I'm a journalist, not a theologian or a preacher. I don't use this kind of language lightly. But I want to submit to you that given the special responsibility we Americans bear for creating the present chaos and insecurity in Iraq, and given the fact that we Catholics pride ourselves on being part of a global communion of saints, that is, thinking more broadly than our national borders, the fact that the fate of the church in Iraq is not a front-burner source of daily ferment and anguish and concern for the Catholic Church in the United States, the fact that this is not what we get out of bed in the morning thinking about it, I think this is nothing short of a moral scandal. Okay? It is a failure that will haunt us. And I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that if we American Catholics would spend 1/10 of the energy we invested in debating the new translation of the Mass, right? Whether we say, "and also with you," or "and with your spirit," if we would take 1/10 of that time and treasure and invest it in solidarity and advocacy on behalf of our suffering brothers and sisters in Iraq, we could change the world. All right. Second dispatch from the front lines comes from Egypt. As you know, Egypt captured the imagination of the world of late with the Tahrir Square uprising and the promise of an Arab Spring, the promise of dislodging an authoritarian police state with the new spirit of democracy and tolerance and pluralism in the Arab world. And of course, one continues to hope that that dream will come true. But I will tell you for sure that for the roughly 10 million Coptic Christians in Egypt, it's the largest Christian community in the Middle East, it represents roughly 10% of Egypt's national population. For those Christians in Egypt, their deepest fear today is that the Arab Spring is going to turn into a cold Christian winter. Because their fear is that what is going to take shape in Egypt is some form of Islamic theocracy, and that the first victims of that theocracy will be the Christian minority of the country. And just to make the point that this is not some hypothetical, overheated, exaggerated fear, let's talk for a moment about what is now known as the Maspero massacre of last November, in which a large group of Coptic Christians, and by the way, it wasn't just the Christians, they were also joined by many of their Muslim brothers and sisters in Egypt who share the same dream of a religiously tolerant society, conducted a peaceful protest in downtown Cairo. And at one stage during that protest, the roughly 200,000 people who had gathered to take part were set upon by a small group of hooligans associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Rocks began to be thrown. Seeing this, the Egyptian army panicked and opened fire, leaving 27 Christians dead and hundreds others wounded. And they now think of it, that the title for it is the Maspero Massacre, but they actually think of it as the Christian Kristallnacht. Reference being, of course, to that famous Night of the Broken Glass in Nazi Germany that augured the beginning of the end for Germany's Jewish minority. Many Christians think of what happened that day in Cairo, the Maspero Massacre, as the same thing for them, a sign that the handwriting is on the wall and that the end may be near. It should also be said that just this week, the Coptic Christian minority in Egypt lost its leader, Pope Shenouda III, the guy who had presided over the Coptic community in Egypt for 41 years, who was a treasured, enormously respected spiritual leader in Egypt, so they now feel even more bereft, more adrift, more exposed than ever before. And the deepest fear of Egyptian Christians is that their church is going to go the way of Iraq, that once the police state is gone and the lid is ripped off sectarian tensions in that country, that they will see the same attacks on Christian targets, they will see the same pattern of death and injury and exodus that we have seen in Iraq. And if that happens, ladies and gentlemen, there is a real and present danger that Christianity might be extinguished all across the Middle East. This is their deepest fear. And it is one that I'm sorry to say, one has to acknowledge is not an unreal fear. One can see the elements of reality underneath it. Now, occasionally, Christian leaders in the Middle East have been criticized for being overly close to and supportive of their strongman authoritarian rulers. That was the pattern in Iraq, it was the pattern in Egypt under Mubarak, it is still the pattern today in Syria under Assad. But let me tell you folks, from the point of view of the Christian minority in the Middle East, their choice is not between a police state and a fully functioning democracy. Their choice is between a police state and annihilation. And in that context, it is hard to fault the choice that they make. Okay?